So basically, we are discussing here in this conference that institutional modernization and the digital transformation in the legislative should be considered a priority by legislatures across the globe. Either they are national and subnational level. Subnational legislatures have an important role to play in this field, and similarly to the strategy of their national counterparts, they should be able to reach out to other institutions nationally or abroad for establishing bonds of cooperation and collaboration. In this panel discussion, we will deep dive in the challenges and opportunities for the legislative digital transformation at a subnational level, both at Brazil and the US. So my first question is to you, Leonardo. During this conference, we have seen remarkable cases from national and subnational legislatures digitally transforming its legislative activities, especially applied to the legislative process. Even though subnational legislatures in some countries have more complex legislative process dynamics and could benefit the most from the digital transformation, it's uncommon to see these legislatures cooperating at an international level. My question is, in your opinion, why should a subnational legislatures undertake this process of change, and why should they reach out to their peers in Brazil and abroad?
Okay, thank you very much, Luís. I'm delighted to be here with you again today and with Pan and Raphael. So for starters, I believe that the first reason is not primarily related with digital transformation. As far as I can see, it has to do with the idea of federation, or the idea of having subnational legislatures endowed with a considerable amount of legislative power. This means, on the one hand, that you can customize and adapt the law to local circumstances and react to problems in a more effective way. But on the other hand, it also wants to create room for experimentation. So you want to foster the idea that a different set of people looking into a different context might come up with ideas and solutions that are worth spreading. Cooperation means primarily that you are alert to your surroundings, you are following what's happening in other legislatures, and you're trying to identify patterns and best practices. Moreover, you're also aware that some solutions are not actually working, and some paths should be avoided. So cooperation is learning from each other's experience, and this is, as far as I can see, the first and foremost reason for cooperation between legislatures. Second, cooperation is also joining forces to build something, to create something new, and all differences and particularities apart, legislatures tend to be remarkably similar institutions, especially when it comes to their operation and organization. That means if the legislatures work together, sometimes with the help of a hub institution such as Inteligov in Brazil, for instance, you might be able to develop products that fit the needs of everyone with only a fraction of the cost, for instance, which in times of crisis is always great. This is particularly true when it comes to legislative process. And you can also make relevant information and solutions flow more easily through the legislative system when you're cooperating. So third, I think that legislative cooperation advances a more comprehensive knowledge on the legislative branch and its operation. And here I'm speaking particularly about the legal side of legislative process. I feel, and here I'm talking about Brazilian reality, which I'm acquainted with, there's few people writing and doing research on legislative process and parliamentary law at all. It seems a bit arcane and mysterious for people outside parliaments and our law schools, with one single exception. They do not have mandatory courses on legislative process or theory of legislation or such. So there's a great plus for cooperation, which is the possibility of creating a network for discussing complex topics with people that deal with the same reality on an everyday basis. And finally, I think that cooperation tends to translate into an institutional apparatus that can help legislatures to better accumulate knowledge and interact to solve common problems. On that particular, Inteligov, for instance, is a bit an image of Brazilian federalism, because it's like the central government is very predominant. But things can happen the other way around, of course. And sometimes this apparatus, these institutions, they can emerge from the day-to-day interactions between legislators or state legislatures or local legislatures that are actually cooperating. So I can only see that there are many positive sides for this sort of initiatives and not too many cons here.
Thank you, Leo, for your opening remarks. Pam, would you like to share your thoughts on top of what Leo just told us and on my previous question?
Sure. Thank you, Luís. It's great to be here. Well, for the National Conference of State Legislatures, an important part of our mission is promoting communication among state legislatures generally, and collaboration in IT is a very important part of that. And so, but also for us at NCSL, it's not a matter of whether a state legislature should or should not evolve its technological processes. Instead, our role is to support them and give them useful information, examples to help chart the course that works best for their legislature. And there are 50 different ways to design a state legislature, and 99 if you count chamber differences, House and Senate in the US, which matter, and not to mention international differences. So, what transformation looks like for one might be a longstanding practice in another. And so, what's an easy, non-controversial change in one might be a legally difficult process in another. And so we've seen that in a number of examples, like remote participation. That said, a lot of our members feel that, talking with their colleagues, they find those are the only people who really understand what they do. I mean, you can't go to an IT conference and get the same kind of connection and ideas and information that is really crucial to that. So, I think that, there's a number of sort of considerations that might be seen as not necessarily universal, but common that legislatures take. And those, for example, does the kind of innovations that they might be learning from others, does that suit the legislature's need? And does it suit that particular legislative culture and environment? There may be that in some states are states where there's a lot of technology companies and the population is highly technical, and they may be more familiar with technology and using current devices that you can consumer applications that we are all getting used to using on a daily basis. And those may be there may be states where they're more open to those to different and newer innovations and applications than other states where there may be a more traditional legislature. The other thing that is common among most state legislatures is that technological innovation often speeds things up. But legislatures, commonly, they're bodies based on traditions, and they have procedures that have been adopted to help ensure a deliberative approach to building consensus in particular, or hearing a multitude of views and policy making in general. So, this work can be slow by design or is slow often by design. So the question they may ask is, will technology speed up the process more than is merited in a particular state? For example, some legislators' chambers expressed hesitancy about remote participation, in part because there's a recognition, that being able to talk with someone face to face is important to reaching mutually acceptable agreements. But as technology makes meeting without physical interaction possible, there's a fear that it will negatively impact the relationship building that's crucial to compromise. But it does seem that the pandemic accelerated changes in the use of technology. And at NCSL just last month, we surveyed legislative IT directors, and more than 90% agreed that the pandemic accelerated changes in the use of technology in their legislature. And a majority also agreed that the pandemic increased legislators' awareness of technology in the legislative process. So that's a pretty much across the board reaction. That really, I think, has accelerated the innovation in many of those states.
Thank you, Pam, for your consideration. Raphael, you are not working directly with the legislatures. You're not from a legislature, but you are from an organization that are seeking to use this data from the legislature, from the legislative process, provide to external users. So why would it be so important for you to legislatures to be interested in the realm of the digital transformation, and why would it be more interesting so for them to be collaborating between each other?
Thank you, Luís. It's a pleasure to be here talking to Leonardo and Pam as well. At Inteligov, our goal is to transform the relationship between the private sector and the public sector. That's what we've been trying to do for a few years now. Of course, data is fundamental so that we can provide information about what's happening in the country regarding not only legislative decisions, but also new regulations from the executive and the judiciary powers as well. But regarding the legislative power, the legislatures, I think I'm side by side with Leonardo regarding cooperation, and with Pam as well, because that's at the core of what NCSL does. And I believe there's a lot to gain because these issues that Leonardo mentioned, like cost and experience sharing, mitigating risk, you share the risk of adopting certain practices, learning from different people, and so cooperation, I think it's fundamental for building any kind of innovation in the legislative. But from the private side where I'm at, we're a startup that collects data, organizes this data, and provides access to external customers. I think we have a common goal to legislatures regarding interoperability, systems that talk to each other. So, for instance, what Leonardo does, not himself with his hands, but what they do with SAPL, for instance, which is an open source system that local houses can use and adopt, is something amazing over here. It's providing a lot of information very fast. We have been noticing an increasing curve of adoption by local houses, especially. And I think the situation is pretty different depending on the country, because there are different kinds of federalisms, like where each instance have different powers. Here in Brazil, for instance, we have this case with 6,000 local governments with a lot more constitutional competencies than the state governments. They can do a lot more than the states, the 26 states and the federal district. So I think it's a pretty hard challenge, but I think the legislative here is way ahead of the executive, way ahead of the judiciary even, who's now taking a few steps back on transparency because of cost problems, how this data is accessed and so forth. But I think it's both in the interest of the private sector and the public sector to have more public data and more interoperability with this data, because it doesn't help if you have different structures everywhere and this data you can't cross this information.
Thank you, Rafa. Leo, before I give the word back to you for your final comments on this round, I'd like to share some thoughts on what you just shared and what we saw during this conference. Basically, we are seeing that although legislatures are unique in their nature, they are traditional, they are slow-moving sometimes, institutions. Most of them have very similar challenges. If we go and take a look on the lawmaking process, we have common steps that are necessary in all legislatures. And some of the largest challenges, they are also common to, for example, a legislature from a medium to a small size in Brazil and a subnational legislature in the US. Of course, the complexity is far different, but we are talking about here fundamental structures, such as what Raphael just shared about APL from Interlegis, but also from other structures as well. So from our point of view, it could be interesting for legislatures in the same way parliaments do. For example, we have Parliamentary, we have IPU, we have working groups in the European Parliament, we have working groups in the Pan-African Parliament, we have the hubs from the IPU at the regional level, at the thematic level. So, for example, parliaments are accessing this network, they are sharing this expertise, they are sharing with colleagues their challenges, even more so during the pandemic. So our question is, at Bússola Tech, we started to think, why our subnational legislatures are not doing the same? So in the US, for example, let's imagine the State Assembly of California and in Brazil, the State Assembly of São Paulo. They are much larger than most national legislatures that we have. They have quite complex challenges in the legislative process. So the idea is, how can we bring them together in one legislative community for the digital transformation? And Leo, I leave that to you. So what are your final thoughts on this round?
Well, thank you, Luís. This is all very interesting. Thank you, Pan and Raphael, for your remarks. I totally agree with you. So something that came to me while you were speaking is that we really have to pay attention to detail and particularities. As Pan was saying, we have to understand how different legislatures work if we want to promote some kind of cooperation between them. And for that reason, for me, it is very important that some kind of institutional mediation is able to facilitate this movement. I think that, of course, I'm here working with Interlegis now for over 3 months, so it's been not long. But I've already witnessed very important consequences for local legislatures that they happen because they're coming to talk with us, and then we can explain a huge amount of processes. We can provide them with lots of options on what they can actually choose to use to solve their problems. But the thing here is that our local legislatures, they are not doing anything on their own way. They are simply not doing it when it comes, for instance, on digital transformation. So it's easy for us to come across with a product such as the SAPL and say, take it, use it. It will help you solving your problem, of course. And that is great for transparency and interoperability, as Raphael was saying, because we are spreading the same open source, open data software for 5,500 cities across the country. But this also signals to us that we need to stimulate some kind of response. We need to stimulate local legislatures to engage and also produce and circulate information and products and solutions that they were able to develop. And this is easier when you're and then I'm going back to your question, and it's easier to do that when you're dealing with the state legislatures. And that is why on the core of our current strategy to promote legislative education for local legislatures, we are trying to engage the schools of governance of more than 10 states of Brazil, because they are well equipped with staff and with IT resources and knowledge and very qualified personnel to deal with this kind of problems. And we are trying to give a gentle nudge. So let's work together, and then we might reach a larger audience, because if I'm doing this with my team here at the Senate, we'll be reaching like 400 local legislators a year when we're talking about this process of educating legislators on this very hot current topics, on politics, on public policy, on fiscal questions, and so on. And it's simply easier to do it with state legislatures, because we can not only reach 400, we can hit 4,000, and this is almost 10% of the entire number of local legislators in the country.
Thank you, Leo, for your consideration. I'd like to move to the second round now. My question is to you, Pan, this time. During our conference, we have deep dive into the main challenges of the legislative digital transformation, going from the implementation of remote capabilities to the usage of AI in the legislative process. Legislatures have different priorities and degrees of digital maturity, which directly impacts their view of their own challenges and consequently the digital transformation strategy. Based on your experience, what are the main challenges you believe a digital transformation strategy can help the subnational legislatures to solve? And are they so different from national, and are they so different between national and subnational levels?
Yeah, thank you, Luis. Well, with respect to challenges, a few that we've heard about, very common, not surprising probably, so that even as we know there are legislators and staff who are pushing for digital transformation, there is also resistance to change. So some legislatures may use old sort of homegrown systems, and you can find long-standing champions of those systems serving within the legislative body or the staffing structure. And so there can be resistance to changes that might affect the legislative process as well. But often if one state innovates and others learn about it and see it, that's one way that they may start to overcome that challenge in their state. Another obvious challenge is the cost. You know, in most years, the information technology budget line is often not a priority. Some legislatures can't even afford to pay for hardware for members, let alone staff. But one example recently in the US was federal money that was made available due to the pandemic. And that actually was used in some states to make important technological upgrades. And so, for example, in North Dakota, the legislature was able to purchase committee room technology to allow them to stream committee sessions live and provide for remote meetings as well. So that was an innovation that other states were able to use some federal money as well there. Staffing, of course, is another challenge. Legislatures not only compete with other local public sector employees for IT talent, but they also must compete with the private sector. And often these employers can offer higher pay and sometimes more workplace flexibility than a legislative employer can. So if you're looking to hire a change agent, this roadblock might get in your way. But again, nevertheless, legislatures can offer other incentives, a stable job, public service, the opportunity to do public service, and other attractions. And then lastly, public perception, and this is related to cost as well. Legislatures don't or aren't always able to invest in themselves or as institutions. They may come into criticism for spending taxpayer dollars on themselves and the institution. And they may want to just show that they're conservative in the way they spend money. So, but in such cases, you know, often an incremental approach to implementing new systems can work. So those are just a few of the kinds of challenges we've heard about.
Thank you, Pam, for your consideration. Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts, Raphael, about this topic.
Sorry,
You're
I
muted.
lost the microphone icon over here. I just found. I totally agree with Pam regarding the slow and steady movement we can do to digital transformation inside legislature. So I worked in the government for quite some time, and I'm a lawyer, but even when I was in the public service, I was already trying to code and solve some problems with code, because my job was hard. And so I started doing simple things like whenever we had to send a letter to someone, we had to pick up the phone, call another department who had the number which we had to put on the letter, and then they crossed this number and we could use it. So I just built a system that would auto-generate these numbers for the whole court. I was working in the judiciary back then. So I see that this works, and I think that when you try to implement huge changes at one time, sometimes they don't stick, and sometimes they bring so much havoc that everybody gets traumatized and don't want to try again anything for a long period. So I'm a fierce advocate for that slow and steady movement for you to try and implement digital transformation. However, I think getting back to your question, I think that as long as the legislatures can map their challenges, what they need to solve, what is more important, this is the first step to solve these issues incrementally. So what you want is more participation, and I think this is one of the challenges that you can solve with technology. If this is something that the political body wants to, and I would say not the political body, but the political institutions or the political agreements in that given society. If that's what's proposed of them, I agree with Pam that this participation through technology can sometimes seem that it's harming the face-to-face interactions, which we now during the pandemic felt so much. But I also think that given the size of some states or even some cities, it is crucial to actually foster participation. I think it's an opportunity to educate for participation as well. You can teach new generations that participation is something more inserted in your day-to-day. So I think you need to go slow, map well, and there's a lot of gains there.
Thank you, Raphael. Leo, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So there's this very interesting side to Pam's comment on the human resources front. So we are experiencing something similar here in Brazil, because the civil service in Brazil has changed, has experienced a lot of changes in the recent years, and particularly on the IT teams, we are currently losing a lot of people to the private sector. And our entire IT model was based on hiring permanent staffers who were very well paid, and this is a very expensive strategy. And now we discovered that those guys will produce wonderful software solutions, but now they have to take care of these children, and this is also very costly, and you just cannot, we cannot make ends meet. So there's progressively fewer and fewer people engaged permanently in the civil service with IT, and this will probably have a huge repercussion in the near future. And there's also the idea of resistance to change, which is very interesting. The pandemic, of course, accelerated change and made change that was imminent possible, and not necessarily things would go that fast without the pandemic. I don't believe that they would, because there's some resistance to transparency, and digital transformation imposes a lot of transparency. It makes everything that's happening within the legislature more visible, faster, quicker. Everything's happening in real time. And even for staffers, and it's very difficult to manage. There's also some kind of impact of this acceleration of the politics, this acceleration of time that digital transformation imposes upon us. And I'm not sure if the politicians or professional politicians who currently work as legislators of MPs, representatives, they fully understand the impact of this acceleration of time. I can tell you that looking into current negotiations and bills that are going to the floor of the houses in Brazil, things are changing in a way that maybe was not entirely expected when we engaged in this remote deliberation system in the first place. And so I think that we have a lot of material to think about when it comes to this resistance of change. It's certainly very relevant if we're trying to understand the challenges that are ahead of us in promoting cooperation and digital transformation in subnational level of legislatures.
Thank you, Leo, for your considerations. And Pam, before I give back the floor to you, Leo, I remember a conversation I had with a colleague from a national parliament. They are also having this issue with HR, because basically now for developers and IT staff, they don't have to, they have even less strings to the territory. So basically they can provide their services overseas to companies that are actively hiring them to perform their job. For example, they can say in the US or in Brazil and provide a service for the UK, for example. And this college,
the exchange rate is killing us, because it's like 5 euros to $1. So it's an unfair competition.
And basically something that this colleague said, okay, Luis, for me to hire an IT guy, it's an easy task, but I need to train this person. I don't need just an IT person. I need an IT person that understands the basics of the legislative institution. They need to understand the basics of the legislative process, because they are either the product manager and managing an outsource or an in-house team, or they are either developing the solution and they need to provide insights for me. So she said, okay, each person I lose for the private sector, I lost an investment of time, of energy between 1.5 years and 2 years to train this person. So she said, this is a challenge. We don't know how to solve that yet. And if a national parliament saying that to us, I cannot imagine the challenge of the national legislatures that doesn't have the same means to keep their brilliant mind on serving the public. So for example, in the US, I learned about a very interesting initiative, for example, at the national level. It's called Tech Congress. They are selecting people and helping IT people to get into parliamentary offices to provide assistance in technical terms to these MPs. So Pam, I'd like to give the floor back to you for your final considerations on this topic.
Yeah, sure. Well, a couple of things that come to mind. One of the challenges often is some legislatures may have long-term employees, as I think we heard, and they're coming up on retirement, and they have knowledge about legacy systems that can't be replicated with in today's IT world, and necessarily without a lot of difficulty. And so that serves as that's a challenge, but it could also be an incentive for moving legislatures forward, moving off of legacy systems. Another thing I think Raphael mentioned was, one person can create innovations. And so it's not always going to be the IT staff. It might come from power users and others within the legislature who, may come up with an innovation that is, that can be further developed and shared among other states. And I think, we talked about transparency as well and how, that's a challenge. Sometimes it's not always welcome and can expose sometimes, an inability, unfamiliarity with technology sometimes when it's so transparent. And so I think that while people want to move forward in that way, there's sometimes some pushback on that. Lastly, we talked about a Congress, and one of the things the U.S. Congress has recently put in place is a committee on modernization of the legislative institution. And they have come to NCSL and asked us for if they can hear from us about what state legislatures are doing. And state legislatures can often be much more nimble than Congress in not only in policy making, but also in information technology. And so we had representatives from Washington State and California who spoke to this committee and kind of helped show how states are areas or institutions that can be a good model for not only each other, but for the National Congress too.
Thank you, Pam, for your consideration. Now we are moving to the third and sadly the final round of our discussion here today. For me, I could stay the entire day. I actually stayed the entire day, but but we are reaching out the end of our discussion. And I do have a question for you, Raphael. I want to start this last round with you. We know legislatures, they are late adopters, if we can use this expression, and technological innovations due to the nature of their consensus building and the decision-making process and their historical institutional traditions and its functions, which must be respected. It means that a legislative digital transformation strategy must be focused on the increased effectiveness of the legislative process in a way that doesn't upset the institutional tradition and the internal balance of power. My question to you is, do you agree with this assessment? And how can we make real-world gains for staff and MPs and subnational legislatures?
I always forget the microphone. So I partially agree with this statement because I think technology should always come after politics. Politics is the core that must be preserved and respected, and especially nowadays where we're seeing a constant questioning of democracy and the value of the liberal society as we've been building it for years and years. So I think it's really important to respect politics, but I also think that even though consensus building and tradition are important aspects that should be respected, they can also be respected with some innovation coming along the way. Technology is a pure set of tools that can be used to move these traditions and this the consensus building even further. So, and sometimes tradition can be used, can be disassociated with the political meaning that it once had. So sometimes I can give an example here. Sometimes I'm not saying especially the legislative bodies, but the government as a whole can be quite fast to implement new innovations, bring innovation to the table when it's interesting to them. Here in Brazil, for instance, we just approved our version of the GDPR, the Privacy Act from Europe, and we are already facing a lot of governments denying access to some kinds of information from their civil servants, from budgeting, or like we saw recently, from sanctions to civil servants and military servants. And I think we had a pretty standard and a pretty comfortable feeling that the principle of publicity of the government acts was imposed since '88, pretty new to us. But now they're discussing that while we have the Access of Information Act, we also have the privacy of our staff to look after, and they're innovating pretty quickly and in closing the access to some data. But I think technology can help a lot. And I agree that the goal of digital innovation is to increase the effectiveness of the legislative process. But I don't think that I totally agree that it should be in a way that doesn't upset institutional traditions. I think being in the private sector, I think I can be less conservative and a little more critical. And I think there are some traditions that should be provoked and should be poked and should be tested and should be put to the test. But I also think that technology could be used not only to increase effectiveness, but also the efficiency of the process. But the main thing is political again. What is an efficient legislative body that works with efficiency, with the least resources and delivers the most results? In Brazil, we have an awful understanding that this is to produce more legislation. The city councilman that produces more bills usually gets his picture in the newspapers saying he was the winner, and the other one who had only a single bill presented is the one who didn't work and didn't do anything useful. And I think this discussion has to be made as well. And I think that for solving these questions, cooperation, association again is the most meaningful way to achieve results. The work again, the work that you three are doing, like Bússola, Interlegis, and CSL, I think it's fabulous work, because Pam and Leonardo in a national level and Luís in an international level are allowing for these traditions to be poked a little, or at least to make people more interested in it.
Leo, with you.
So thank you, and Raphael, thank you for your words. And I agree with you that we definitely should upset some traditions. And this is basically what introducing digital transformation into parliamentary practice mean, that you're changing things. For instance, I was the parliamentarian or the clerk of the House of Representatives of Brazil, which is the Chamber of Deputies. And by the time I started, if you are willing to discuss a bill, then you have to go and climb up to the table and sign your name into a list. And this is tradition, and there is a line. But this is like, why? I can just grab my phone and like inscribe myself in the list without having to climb all the way up to the table and do that up there. But the tricky thing is that sometimes when you're introducing change, you are maybe altering the balance between partisan forces represented within Congress. And we need to understand that, like, filibustering is a legitimate way of acting within a parliament. And when you look at the opposition in Brazil, for instance, people who oppose Bolsonaro's government, they will say, okay, I don't want to vote anything. I want to make things harder for the government. If the government has control over the House's agenda, I don't want to vote anything. And when you introduce like remote deliberation, you make it easier to say that you are present at a committee's reunion, or you're present at the floor of the House, and then you get quorum faster, and you can engage in deliberation faster, and you can vote faster, because the chamber is a city. You might take up to 10 minutes from your office on the fourth annex building of the chamber until the floor of the House, and all people are like moving for one vote. And sometimes when you have a huge filibuster in a bill, you have to make 20, 25 votes to get to the end of it. And people are moving all the way. They go there, then they do their biometric identification, and then they cast the vote, and it takes forever. And when you're doing that on your smartphone, it takes like 3 minutes. And if you are against the government, then introducing the system is a huge obstacle to your filibustering strategies. And this is like complex, because you need to make things go smoother and faster and more efficient, but you may not tamper with the balance of political forces within the House, because that will have drastic political consequences. So this is tricky and very complicated. And I hope we actually can find some balance between these two different trends.
Thank you, Leo. Sam, would you like to comment on top of what Rafa and Leo just shared with us?
Well, sure. Very interesting comments. For us at NCSL, promoting digital transformation, it doesn't really mean advocating for it. Rather, it means surfacing up and highlighting, again, sharing information about the innovations and solutions that the legislative chambers have found to be beneficial. And importantly, it also means highlighting some changes that may have created unintentional problems for our members, and then getting them together to troubleshoot those issues and learn from each other. So it's important, I think, for those watching this session to know that we don't necessarily assume that digital transformation will be the best way to solve a particular problem. But, again, change can be transformational, it can be incremental and subtle, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, instantly transformational to be a benefit to the legislatures. And so our members have talked to us about some of the kinds of things that technology has enabled for them. And improving legislative transparency and public participation, as we've talked about. For example, prior to the pandemic, a few state legislatures had offered citizens the ability to testify in committee from remote locations. So, for example, somebody in rural Colorado, where I'm located, would not have to drive 2 hours in a snowstorm to the state capitol to testify for 2 minutes. So, we had a few states that had allowed us a separate area where they could go to near their home and testify. Of course, the pandemic made that possible for many other citizens in other states to testify from their home. But another aspect would be U.S. state houses, where they're small. They're typically very small historic buildings, and the physical footprint doesn't allow a large number of citizens to gather there. So, people from several legislatures have talked to NCSL about how virtual meeting technologies allowed sort of unmatched levels of public participation this past year. They were surprised by how many people were interested in participating. And in this last year, we saw many legislatures add online applications like a request to testify online form that would allow them to make a reservation to speak. So they could do it on their smartphone, make a reservation to speak in front of a committee later. They've also added ways for citizens to submit testimony electronically, which was relatively rare previously among state legislatures. And then they have applications that allow citizens to track the progress of bills or find out when a committee is meeting to hear a particular bill. So we've kind of been tracking those and created a chart on the web with links to those examples in the 50 state legislatures. And then even though previously, prior to the pandemic, all 50 states had live streamed their floor sessions, we found during the pandemic that committee sessions, large increase in the number of states that were streaming all committee sessions. So we also have another chart that sort of provides links to showing the number of states that do that. And then making information available in new ways and formats that can make policy process easier and bring new information to light for legislators. So, for example, displaying proposed amendments in context to show exactly where an amendment would appear in a bill, and that can help clarify those changes for a policymaker. Another example, compare programs or applications that show changes in bill versions over time, and that can sometimes highlight key issues to consider and why a bill may or may not be successful. And so California is an example of a state that has that kind of information, and I know there are others as well. And then sort of lastly, sort of a convenience factor, allowing members to make their own private notes on bills so that they can note if they're supporting or other kinds of information, and then generally moving applications to the web so that they're available to members, and providing them with the laptops or tablets or phones so that they can access that information anytime and from anywhere, and then also reduce the use of paper as well. So, I think those are just some of the kinds of examples where sharing of information has promoted those kinds of features.
Thank you, Pam, for your consideration. Rafa, before I give back the floor for you, let me give you a very, very brief comment. I totally agree with all of you said. Maybe I would change the verb, what Rafa suggested. Maybe not poking, but maybe highlighting to people what are the traditions in the legislative. And Leo brilliantly said the effects of the digital transformation process on the internal balance of power. I usually say to colleagues that many things can disturb the internal balance of power. I wouldn't recommend the digital transformation strategy to be the actor disturbing it. Maybe if the IT team or the clerk team is seen as someone that is disturbing and meddling in the political balance of power, maybe you could build resistance towards a process that should be widespread accepted. Maybe focusing a little bit on the tradition specifically. I have an example that I was discussing with a former member of US Congress, and he was saying, Luís, for me to be recognized by the speaker and then cast my vote is important because it's important for my constituents. They are seeing me casting my vote. If you're developing an app and I can cast my vote there, I can cast my vote from my district, it's much easier for me. But maybe my constituents will not see me as representative of their interests as they would be otherwise. So it's important, according to, in this case, it's important for the member to be recognized because it's a sign of transparency and accountability, because he's standing up between his peers to cast his or her vote. So it's an interesting approach because when we understand the core value here, accountability, transparency, maybe we can understand this core value and build a new process around it. And saying, okay, maybe standing up and ask to be recognized was a sign of transparency in the 18th century, maybe 50 years ago. but maybe we have a better process now that will be outdated in 50 years as well. So that's the provocation we brought. And Pam, you touched it with the NATO very briefly here. Leo and I have a common colleague that wrote an article about this, Thiago Peixoto from the World Bank. Basically, he proposed a provocation about how about having the legislatures in the cloud, not only for the pandemic, but as a resilient method for any kind of crisis. So Parliament is no longer just a historical building, but Parliament, in my words now, Parliament becomes a democratic value. So you're not really, you don't depend on people reaching out to that building for democracy to work. So I believe it's an interesting approach when you said, for example, I went to Colorado, I was in the middle of a snowstorm, so it's hard for MPs to pass through that moment to provide a testimony of 2 or 3 minutes. Raphael, I would like to invite you to share your final thoughts with us so we can close the round, this round, close this panel, and close this day of the conference.
Of course. Thank you for all your comments. They're pretty... I totally agree with you again. My view is much more from the outside, and I think we could agree that maybe transparency could be the balance there for digital innovation. I believe, as I said before, that politics should come first. Filibustering is a right, and what I think is that we should maybe use transparency and information, as Pam highlighted, as we should use these concepts as the line where we draw the digital innovation. We need to provide more transparency. We need to provide more information for those of us who are outside. And so that was my intention when I was talking about digital transformation. And however, I'll respect your right to highlight, Luís, the traditions, but I think from the outside I could still poke the traditions, and I think it's necessary. But I think we need to preserve politics. I think this is the most important. And just to finish up about filibustering, I was once we here in Brazil, we love what we call casos, to tell short stories about what happened to us, or that didn't happen, but we say it did. And I once worked for the how do you call the majority leader, and in one given legislature, and we sometimes had these votes that would take place late at night, and it was in the 1990s yet, so no digital innovation whatsoever. And my role in this late night votes was to stand against a wall looking at a given MP, because he always, when it got late, he loved to drink a little, and then he started getting sleepy and went away, and I had to bring him back to his seats, and oh no, come here, sit here, it's comfy, and I'll get you a coffee or something like this. So I think non-technological means in politics are extremely necessary, and they're part of politics. But I think there's a lot of other things we could improve with technology.
Thank you, Rafa, for your closing remarks and for your caso. Well, we are reaching out the end of our discussion here today. It was a pleasure to welcome all of you. And very briefly, all of you, if you want, like 30 seconds, 1 minute to share your closing remarks. Rafa, you had the floor. Would you like to begin?
No, just thank you all. It was great to be here with all of you. The discussion was really enlightening for me, and it's good to bring these eyes from an outsider and to poke you all over here.
Thank you, Rafa. Pam, would you like to share your final thoughts with us as well?
Yeah, I'd just like to join them, thanking you for inviting NCSL to be part of this program. It's been a pleasure to hear some of the other sessions and to be part of this distinguished group. I really appreciate that. And I congratulate you, Luís, on all your work and all the speakers and, you know, this very successful event. It's very impressive.
Thank you, Pam. Leo, would you like to share your final thoughts with us as well?
Yeah, thank you very much, Luís, for this invitation. I'm delighted to participate. Thank you, Pam. It is a fantastic job you're doing out there, and I'm looking forward to learn more about your work. Thank you, Raphael. The same. It's a very interesting conversation. I really like the idea of a parliament moving completely to a digital world. It's a possibility that can help us to dodge authoritarian blows at any time. That would be fantastic. I hope we don't need it in Brazil. That would be a fantastic feature of a parliament. And as for digital innovation that shifts the balance of power, maybe we can borrow that Rawlsian idea of the veil of ignorance, the original position here. Like you're starting, you take this decision when you don't know who will be the majority and the minority on the next legislature. So maybe the timing for this decision is crucial to make things really work. And thank you very much for inviting me, Luís, and congratulations on this great event.
Thank you, all of you. Most notably, thank you, Leo, for all the support from Interlegi. Thank you, Pam, Natalie, and Stacy on NCSL side for all the help on providing the best cases on the US as well to be part of this conference. And thank you, Rafa, for being part of this discussion with us.